Welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Bussemeyer and thank you for joining me in my workshop today. Today we have a ton of content to cover and I know it can be really overwhelming when you're first branching out and thinking about starting to use knits when sewing. But I wanted to start today off by just sharing a few of the benefits to get you excited about the possibilities and the opportunities that learning how to use knits and create garments out of a knit material have to offer you. So first and foremost, they are so comfortable. Now, I don't know about you, but I almost always am wearing something knit on top. My tops are most often knit just because they are so comfortable to wear. Dresses for me will oftentimes be made out of a knit material as well, as who doesn't love a comfy pair of knit pants to lounge around in the evening, or those knit version slack pants when you need to get a little dressed up. Whatever it is, knit garments are always a huge comfort factor. So that is the main plus point for me anyways when I think about knit garments. The next thing I love about knits is that it's really easy to get a great fit. Having that stretch to it, you get more shape to the garment just by pulling it on your body and it molding to you. This means we have less darts and seams, which also means that we can sew the project quicker. It's quicker to cut out, it's quicker to piece together, just because we don't need as many of those darts and seams to bring that 3D shape into the garments to match our bodies. As always with sewing, we're taking a 2D medium and making it something that we can put on our 3D bodies, and we want it to fit us properly and well, and of course have that comfort factor. So knits have a lot of good kind of plus points or bonus points when it comes to fit and comfort when sewing. Now let's move on to my top tips for working with knits. Now, there are differences between working with wovens and knits, and some of these you might have heard before, yet they are really crucial to get a great fit and have a great garment that you can get a lot of use out of. The first is the needle. You must have a ballpoint needle, or also known as a jersey needle. So the reason for this is it's a slightly rounded tip, or it is a rounded tip, varying degrees, and that just causes the threads, when it's piercing the fabric, to move out of the way rather than piercing through the fabric or piercing through those threads. With woven materials, you want to have a really sharp needle so that you can get a good clean stitch line. Yet with knits, just due to the way the garment is constructed, the interlocking of the actual thread itself, if you break a thread, it can cause a hole, and holes will cause, will look bad, but also cause your garments to disintegrate quickly. So you won't get as much use and enjoyment out of a garment, and you definitely don't want to spend all this time and effort on a garment only to have a hole somewhere in it the first time you wear it. So using the proper needle is going to be key just for the longevity and quality of your garment. Next, you need to remember not to stretch your seams. Now, we know this from woven fabrics as well, but due to the fact that knits have a lot more stretch to them, if you're stretching them while you're stitching it, whether it's feeding through the machine, you're gonna have a lettuce leaf, bumpy up and down seam closure, and that is just not attractive unless you're trying to get that lettuce leaf finish on the edge of a t-shirt, which you'll be using an overlock or serger for that, but you may have seen that on different garments where they're intentionally on the hem stretching it out while they're stitching it to cause it to have that little ruffle on the edge. But on general seams, we don't want that to happen, so we want to be really careful we're not stretching it out as we're sewing. Now, we also need to have the right stitch, and this varies depending on the project and which stitches you have available to you. Now, if you're looking at knit garments that are ready-wear, fast fashion garments from the store, you'll notice that they're almost always sewn with a serger or an overlock machine. Now, this stitch is fantastic for closing seams on knit garments just because it's stretchy, so it can move with the fabric when you're putting it on. We've all put on a garment at one point or another where we've heard a breaking of a thread in a seam just because the seam didn't stretch as much as the garment did while we were stretching into it, right? So if we have a stretchy seam on our stretchy material, the seam won't break as quickly when we're getting in and out or wearing the garment. So that's where a stretchy seam is amazing, and the overlock stitch is also great just because it's very similar to a lock stitch or a classic stitch in that it closes in a straight line on the edge where it will be stretched. So it's a very secure closure. Now, not all of us have a serger at our disposal when we're sewing, and this does not mean you can't sew with knits. It just means you need to be a little bit more aware of what kind of seam am I closing where and what kind of stitch do I need to have, and maybe sometimes you'll need to be a little bit more gentle when putting something on or taking something off, just because you know that the stitch doesn't have as much stretch as the fabric itself. Now, stretchy stitches that you'll typically have on a regular sewing machine is the classic zigzag stitch. Just because it's going back and forth as it's closing, you have extra length in the stitch itself. So when you stretch out the material, the zigzags just kind of flatten out. So you have some movement and some extra length there. Now, the stitch isn't always the best option just because it doesn't have a clean, straight clothesline. So when you stretch the seam apart, you'll notice there's a stitch and then there's kind of a little opening, especially depending on how long of a distance your stitches are and how much they zigzag. So if it's a seam, like a side seam, if you have like a pencil skirt where there's a lot of tug, or pants for that matter, closing the crotch seam in the back, and you have a lot of tug on that seam, the zigzag stitch won't be so great just because it won't look very nice when the seam has that stretch and tug to it. Now, you can use a regular straight stitch, but again, it doesn't have any stretch to it really. So you need to be sure that you're careful with those seams when you're getting in and out of the garment, and just be aware of the fact that they can break. So depending on where you want to close a seam, I often love to use, if I'm just using a regular sewing machine, the zigzag stitch, for example, when I'm putting on, a binding that's going to be flipped out. So the stitching is on the inside edge. There's not a lot of tug in between that closure. So a zigzag stitch is great for that because it can stretch over your head with that zigzag, but there isn't a lot of tug, so you won't be seeing that stretching out in between stitches. Same thing with the hem on the bottom or the hem on the arms if you're putting a band on. I love using different widths band. If you've ever been to one of my Kelsey top classes where we've talked about making the top out of a knit material, I would have shown you that technique for hemming it because it looks really professional, and you can use that stretchy stitch when you don't have the ability to do a cover stitch, which most hems on t-shirts have a cover stitch, and yet a lot of overlock machines don't have that capability as well. Finally, some sewing machines will have a knit stitch, and this is a zigzag stitch but very flat. So this stitch can be really annoying to unpick. So if you're not 100% sure if that's where you want to have your seam, you can easily just stitch it with a regular lock stitch that again doesn't have stretch to try it on. And then if you need to unpick it, it's much easier to do that. And then when you know where your final seams need to be, then you can sew it with that knit stitch, and you'll know that that's actually where the placement needs to be, and you won't have to worry about unpicking it, and it will have that little bit of stretch to it. Now they flattened it up so that it does have a more secure straight closure rather than the general zigzag stitch. So depending on what kind of stitches you have to your disposal, what kind of garment you're making, what kind of seam you're closing, you'll need to be aware of, do I need the seam to be very stretchy, or do I need it to be a good clean closure? That can give you some insight into knowing which stitch is best for my project when. Now, when we're thinking about working with knits, the main things you need to keep in mind is the stretch, the amount of stretch, and the direction of the stretch, if it's a one-way or a two-way stretch, as well as the drape of the material. How heavy does it drape, and how much does it stretch out just because of the weight of the drape? Now, these 2 points are important because it will help us dictate the amount of ease or negative ease that we want for the desired fit, as well as understanding if we need to support the seams in any way with interfacing or seam stay or a little bit of elastic, as well as understanding if we need to shorten up the distance between our horizontal lines if the garment is going to drape out longer. Same thing with straps. This gown here, I popped it on the mannequin as it's something that I'm fixing up for one of my clients. A friend of hers made it for her, and there are a few things happening here that we need to fix for her. And one of them is that it just has so much weight and drape, which is a beautiful flow, especially for this because it's actually a full-length dress. But all of that weight tugging on these straps is stretching them out, which causes 2 problems. One, the neckline is too low. It's all sliding down on the body due to that stretch. And 2, it's actually thinning out. You may have noticed in knit garments, when you stretch it, just the amount of threads, the mass of the material has to be spread out over a longer distance, which sometimes causes them to get a little bit sheer. So there's a couple of things you could think about here. First of all, we could add some support to the seam so that it just doesn't want to stretch out, so that the weight of the garment is actually hanging on the seam stay or the elastic that we run in the seam, rather than hanging on the material in the strap itself. The other thing that we could do here is shorten the straps as well. Now, if this is happening in the neck, if it was a very fitted dress, it could be happening throughout the dress, which would mean that the bust line would be dropped down lower, the waistline would be dropped down lower, and so on and so forth all the way down. So you may need to shorten up your garments just in the length if it has a lot of weight. Now, for example, if you have a material that is a two-way stretch that has a ton of stretch to it, this is a great fabric choice for a garment that you want more fitted. If you choose a knit that only has a one-way stretch and maybe has less stretch to it, as well as a knit that has little to no elastic or spandex value to it, you won't want to use it for a garment that you want a really close body hugging fit. Now, the more spandex or elastic you have in it, the more ability the fabric will have to stretch and then retract to the original shape. This is important for leggings, for example. If you've ever had a pair of leggings that has stretched out during use and just feels a little saggy by the end of the day, that's because of the fabric just not having enough elastic aspect to it. So you need to rewash it to get the other fibers to shrink up and tighten up once again. Now, if you want a material to be very body fitted, yet it has little stretch and just a one-way stretch to it, you will once again need more seams and darts to create the shape, just because you can only rely on the material to give you shape in that one direction, as well as it will restrict your movement just because there's less stretch to it. So once you start getting kind of an understanding of what the properties of the fabric are, how they react, and the fit of the garment you want to create, you can start piecing this together. Now, this is a really important sewing skill. I know a lot of us come into sewing thinking if we could only learn the perfect technique, then all of the problems we're having in our garments fit or how it's coming together would just disappear. But it's really about understanding the garment that we want to create, the fit that we want to create, the amount of ease we want to have, and the use of the garment, as well as understanding the properties of the fabric itself, which is constructed of different fibers with different properties, as well as the properties of the different techniques, how to utilize them and put them together successfully to create the perfect alignment. I like to call this system sewing variables and aligning your sewing variables. I really get to dive into this deep in my fitting fashion program, but I also always bring it into any of the little mini fitting fashion series that I do, because this is such a crucial step to understanding sewing and understanding how to get that desired result, that perfect garment, the way you want it. Working with knits, you really need to be clear of how much stretch does my fabric have? Is it a one-way or a two-way stretch? What is the fit that I want to achieve with this garment? Realizing that if you do want a close fit and your fabric is very stretchy, that you may need negative ease or to make the garment smaller than your actual measurements, so that when you put it on, it shapes to you and fits you very nice and snug. Now, understanding that you'll also want a high enough level of elastic or spandex in your garment is also part of the fit, understanding the fit and what you want to use the garment for. If it's a looser flowing knit gown, then there's not going to need to be a lot of retraction in the fabric, so it's not going to stretch out on you while you're wearing it. It may, however, stretch out on the seams, for example. So understanding just the drape and the hang, how much weight am I dealing with? Are the seams going to stretch out, hang out? Even though I didn't stretch them when I sewed them, maybe I want to put a little bit of supportive interfacing or elastic on those seams. Before we end this episode, I wanted to dive into Sue's questions. She emailed in and asked, how do you use a pattern intended for knit materials for a woven fabric and vice versa? So this is a really great question, and going back to understanding the variables, which is why this is such a big part of my one-year program, is understanding how to align variables as well as understanding the properties of both fibers and fabrics will help you understand this transition. Now, the difference is, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that woven materials, to get a close fit, will need a lot more seams and darts to them, whereas knit material doesn't. Once again, because woven materials have little to no stretch most often, then you'll need a lot more ease just so that you have movement and you're not restricted by the garment when you put it on, whereas a knit garment will move with you. So understanding just the difference of the amount of seams and darts and shapes that you put into a garment, as well as the amount of ease changes over. So for example, if I take a garment and say it's a knit pattern and it doesn't really have any seams or darts to it, but that's okay because I want to make a woven top that's just really flowy, just drapes straight down, isn't hugging me at all. You'll want to be really clear as to how much ease you want and how much movement you want in that piece. You may need to size up, for example, a few sizes so that you can achieve the amount of ease and room necessary, whereas with the knit version, you could wear that smaller size because even though it was flowy when you put it on, you could stretch it while you're getting it on. On the other hand, maybe just adding a closure in that top. So the circumference, the mass of the garment is big enough without needing to stretch. So you can use a woven fabric with no stretch, yet you wouldn't be able to get in and out of the garment due to the fact that the woven material doesn't have any stretch. So I need to add a closure somewhere, a button placket, a zipper. If I want to just add a closure on a garment and I don't want you to notice it and don't want to add any extra seams, I love the invisible zipper under the arm on the side seam. You can even place it upside down. I'll often do that, especially if there's a sleeve. If there is no sleeve, it still can be a little bit tight if you have to end it right under the armhole to slide into it. But if there is a little bit of a sleeve, then I'll just go into the sleeve with my invisible zipper, just, an inch, inch and a half kind of thing, so that I can open up this tight area kind of in between under the arms, right along the bust, to more easily get in and out, and just make that zipper to close at the bottom. So that's a great way if you just want to make an invisible closure to help you get in and out of garments. Same thing with the woven pattern. If I'm using a woven pattern and I want to use it for a knit garment, if I'm using a material that has a lot of stretch to it, I may want to size down. It's always going to seem bigger if it has stretch to the fabric. The other thing is the pattern may have a lot of seams that are just kind of adding extra steps, but not adding any kind of bonus or extra to the design of the garment themselves. And there's different techniques for how you can close seams up or put piece pattern pieces together and bring them together in the 2D flat pattern before you cut it out to change the design around. But that is more, you're getting into more advanced kind of pattern adjusting techniques. And really just understanding that you may need to adjust the amount of ease and adjust the techniques or the production plan, the list of steps to piece the garment together, just because you'll want to use different seams, different closures. That brings us back to why just understanding one technique or the perfect technique doesn't exist with sewing. It's like all of the techniques are great for a specific set of variables, for a specific combination of pattern, desired outcome, fabric, and even the machines that we have and the tools that we have to our disposal when we're putting this garment together. So understanding how to align all of those different pieces will be the key to helping you just create the garments that you want, exactly how you want to have them, and real success with sewing. Changing a pattern from a knit material to a woven material just amplifies all of these areas, which are key to understand in any project. Using a pattern that was intended for one type of material for a different type of material just amplifies all of these little variables that are key to understanding and key to aligning in your projects to really experience success. So understanding them in this setting between woven and knits is only an amplified version of what I teach on a regular basis for each and every project, to really understand what it is you want to create, what is the fit you want to have, and how do I align all of my variables in the right order to really achieve that ultimate goal. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. As I said at the beginning, it was a ton of information. So I hope that didn't overload you, but gave you some insight into the difference between woven and knits and why working with knits can just be so rewarding and so much fun, as well as so exciting to then be able to wear the garments that you've created. Next week's episode is going to be amazing as well. I'm going to be interviewing a style specialist who will give us some tips on how to put together outfits and style just for our personality to express ourselves more through our clothes. Thank you so much again for joining me. I'd love to hear any comments from today or any questions that I didn't get to, and I look forward to joining you again soon on Workshop Wednesday. Be sure to check out my Facebook group if you haven't already done that as well. Bye now.